The blizzard howled outside, but the burning in my throat is what actually woke me. My boss had just locked the heavy cabin door from the outside, leaving me and his 12-year-old son stranded in the snowstorm. Suddenly, Toby, the boy who had been profoundly deaf and autistic his entire life, pulled off his noise-canceling headphones. He looked right at me, his voice perfectly clear. "Don't open the window." Dad is standing out there, waiting for us to suffocate. My mind went completely blank. Toby couldn't speak. He hadn't uttered a single sound since the tragic car accident that took his mother 5 years ago. Yet here he was, staring right through me, warning me about the man I thought was my savior. And to understand how I ended up trapped in a freezing cabin with a supposedly autistic 12-year-old and a murderer waiting outside, you have to understand how easily a lonely heart can be lured into a cage. Growing up bouncing between foster homes, I never knew what a real family felt like. I didn't have childhood memories of warm holidays or a father protecting me. So, when I was hired as a private nanny for Richard's son, I didn't just see a job. I saw everything I had ever craved. Richard was flawlessly charming. He was a wealthy timber magnate, a grieving widower who looked at me with such profound sadness that it made my heart ache. He always wore perfectly tailored suits, smelling faintly of expensive cedar and clove. He played the role of the devoted, heartbroken father with absolute perfection. And he would gently touch my shoulder, his eyes swimming with fake vulnerability, and tell me how much Toby needed a maternal figure, how much he needed someone pure to bring warmth back into his desolate life. We are always taught from a young age that evil has a horrifying face. We expect monsters to hide in dark, terrifying alleys, but criminal psychology tells a much more chilling truth. The most ruthless monsters sit right across from you at the dinner table. They pour your wine, they kiss your forehead, and they speak the gentle language of love. It is a psychological nightmare known as malignant narcissism. Men like Richard do not lack intelligence or charm. The only thing they lack is a soul. To easily control their victims, they don't use physical chains right away. Instead, they build a beautiful golden cage. Richard slowly began to isolate me, using the perfect excuse of privacy. He told me he couldn't stand strangers being around Toby. He took over my meager finances, whispering that he wanted to spoil me so I wouldn't have to stress about bills anymore. He made me feel so incredibly cherished, so deeply protected, that even if I smelled a deadly gas leaking into our living room, my manipulated mind would instantly try to convince me that my perfect Richard had just made an innocent mistake. The most dangerous lie in the world isn't a bold denial of a crime. It is the elaborate illusion of a perfect, undeniable love. That grand illusion was exactly why I didn't hesitate when he insisted we spend the core of the winter at his remote log cabin, buried deep in the Colorado mountains. The news had warned of a record-breaking blizzard. Most people were stocking up and staying close to the city, but Richard just smiled his $1,000,000 smile. He said it would be a magical, cozy retreat. Just the three of us, cut off from the noisy world. When the snow began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets, it buried the mountain roads completely. It took out the power lines for miles, isolating us in a vast, unforgiving sea of white. At the time, wrapped in a blanket by the fire, it felt deeply romantic. Now, looking at the heavy oak door he had just deadbolted from the outside, it felt exactly like a tomb. While I had been busy baking cookies trying to coax a smile out of Toby, Richard had been meticulously setting a stage for murder. This isolated trip wasn't about love or bonding. It was never about love. It was about Toby's multi-million-dollar trust fund, Haas inherited from his late mother's estate. It was a massive fortune that Richard couldn't legally touch as long as Toby was drawing breath. But what if a deeply tragic accident were to happen during a catastrophic storm, a blocked ventilation pipe, an invisible carbon monoxide leak in a snowed-in cabin, and a naive, negligent nanny who carelessly forgot to check the furnace? Richard would get all the money, and the world would give him nothing but sympathy. The tragic mourning father strikes again, losing his son to the incompetence of the help. The bitter, biting cold of the cabin began to seep through the floorboards, snapping me back to the terrifying present. The heavy thud of the deadbolt locking from the outside still echoed in my chest. The deadly, odorless carbon monoxide was already creeping into the room from the tampered heater, threatening to put us to sleep forever. And Richard was standing somewhere out there in the blinding, freezing storm, patiently waiting for his perfect tragedy to finish its final act. I stared at the heavy wooden door, my mind violently replaying the sound of the deadbolt. The warm, perfect image of Richard was shattering into jagged pieces inside my head. I sank to the freezing hardwood floor, my chest tight, not just from the cold, but from a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. He didn't love me. I was just a pawn, a naive, desperate orphan he could frame for the murder of his own son. A small shadow moved past me. Toby. He walked straight to the wall-mounted smart home panel. When the same panel Richard had supposedly locked down with a master passcode before he left. My tear-filled eyes widened as Toby's small, trembling fingers flew across the digital keypad. He wasn't randomly tapping. He was entering bypass commands. "Toby, what are you doing?" I gasped, my voice cracking. He didn't flinch. He didn't cover his ears or rock back and forth like he usually did when there was a sudden noise. He just kept typing. Then, he turned to me. The blank, vacant stare I had known for months was completely gone. In its place were the eyes of an exhausted, terrified old man trapped in a 12-year-old's body. "You want to know how I know his codes, Sarah?" Toby whispered, his voice raspy from years of forced silence. I froze. The sound of his voice, a voice the doctors said would never return, sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. How are you talking? You're supposed to be deaf." Toby looked down at the bulky, noise-canceling headphones in his hands. "Do you know what happens when everyone around you thinks you are completely broken, deaf, and lost in your own mind?" he asked bitterly. "They stop paying attention. They stop hiding things." Dad would leave his tablet unlocked on the kitchen counter right in front of me. Security technicians would punch in alarm codes while I sat on the rug playing with blocks, thinking I couldn't hear or understand a single thing. Toby took a shaky breath, stepping closer to me. 5 years, Sarah. For 5 years, I have lived behind these headphones. During the day, I would stare at the wall, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled so I wouldn't react when he yelled or broke things. At night, when the house was dead silent, I would sneak out of bed and teach myself how to read his digital files, how to pick the locks on his office door using heavy wire. Why would you do that to yourself, Toby?" I cried, reaching out to him. "Because of what happened to my mom," he choked out, a single tear cutting through the dirt on his pale cheek. "She didn't just crash her car on an icy road. I was in the back seat. I saw him messing with the brake lines in the garage the night before. I survived that crash. She didn't. And I knew if I looked normal, if I looked smart enough to remember, I would be next. My intelligence isn't some gift. It is the price of staring death in the face every single day." And his confession tore through my soul. This wasn't some child prodigy from a movie. This was a profoundly traumatized little boy who had been forced to bury himself alive in silence just to survive his own father. The agonizing truth stripped away the last of my paralyzing fear. I looked at Toby's trembling hands. He had fought so hard for so long, all by himself in the dark. I wiped the tears from my freezing cheeks, the vulnerable, desperate nanny who just wanted to be loved. She died the moment that deadbolt clicked. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the heavy plastic of the landline receiver on the kitchen counter. Adrenaline flooded my veins. We had a head start, I was going to call 911 right now. But before my finger could even press the first digit, a small, freezing hand clamped down hard over the keypad. Toby looked up at me, his eyes sharp as a knife. "You can't call them, Sarah. The nearest highway patrol is 40 minutes away in this storm. Dad will be back here in less than 15. I sobbed, trying to pull his hand away. "But they can radio a deputy nearby. At least we'll have someone on the way to protect us." "Did you forget what Dad actually does?" Toby hissed, his voice a harsh, cold whisper. "He doesn't just run a timber company. He is completely obsessed with control. He reconfigured the entire smart home system this morning before he left. If any call goes out to an emergency number from this landline or the local Wi-Fi, the network will instantly bounce a priority alert straight to his phone." My breath caught in my throat. "If you make that call, he will know his carbon monoxide trap failed. He will know we aren't suffocating yet. Instead of walking in blindly to check on our bodies, he'll just ignite the main fuel tank from the outside. We will be ash before the fire trucks even hear the dispatch call." I shivered, dropping the receiver back onto the hook. It hit the plastic base with a dull, hollow thud. The brutal reality of our situation finally slapped me across the face. We were entirely sealed inside a digital tomb, in a predator's game. Running away and crying for help is a privilege reserved for the free. When you are already locked inside the cage, the only way to survive is to become a monster yourself and bite back. We were completely cut off. No phones, no internet, just the howling wind violently rattling the thick glass of the windows. I rushed to the front door, yanking on the heavy iron handle. But it wouldn't even budge. It was deadbolted from the outside. I looked out into the blinding white storm. It was -20 degrees out there. Without heavy winter gear, running into that blizzard meant freezing to death in less than 10 minutes. We were trapped in a beautifully decorated wooden box. But the biting cold outside wasn't our immediate threat. The throbbing in my temples wasn't just fear. It was a rhythmic, pulsing agony. The air in the cabin felt incredibly thick, almost heavy in my lungs. I coughed, tasting something foul in the back of my throat. The modified heater. Carbon monoxide is a coward's weapon. It doesn't announce itself with a harsh chemical smell or a cloud of dark smoke. It is an invisible, silent ghost. Scientifically, it is terrifying. Oh, it binds to your red blood cells more than 200 times faster than oxygen does. It literally starves your organs, forcing your body to shut down while tricking your brain into thinking you are just tired. The lethargy washing over me was incredibly seductive. A dark, whispering voice telling me to just lie down on the soft rug and close my eyes. That was Richard's grand design, a quiet, peaceful sleep for us, and a lifetime of wealth for him. "Sarah, look!" Toby's frantic whisper snapped me out of the deadly trance. He was sitting on the floor, holding the glowing tablet. The exterior security feed was struggling against the heavy blizzard, but the infrared lens picked up a distinct, massive heat signature, a heavy-duty truck, Richard's truck. The brake lights flared bright red on the screen as the vehicle aggressively swerved, tearing through the snowdrifts, making a sharp U-turn back toward the property line. He got an alert. Toby choked out, his fingers trembling on the screen. When I bypassed the main firewall to stop the network from sending out a signal, it triggered an offline failsafe. He knows the system is down. He knows we aren't dead yet. How long, Toby? How long until he gets here? The digital map on the tablet tracked the moving red dot. Toby swallowed hard. 15 minutes, maybe less if he drives recklessly. 15 minutes. The ticking clock echoed in my ears, louder than the howling storm outside. 900 seconds until a murderer walked through that door to finish the job his gas couldn't do. We couldn't run. Stepping into the whiteout was a suicide mission, but if this cabin was going to be our tomb, and I was going to make sure Richard stayed in it with us, "Smash the glass," I ordered, grabbing a heavy brass bookend from the mantel. "We need to vent the gas right now." I swung the heavy metal with all my remaining strength. The thick window pane spider-webbed, then completely shattered inward. A violent, shrieking gust of freezing wind exploded into the cabin. The temperature plummeted instantly, the icy air slicing at my bare arms like razor blades. It was absolute agony, but it was pure, unpoisoned oxygen. I gasped, filling my burning lungs, feeling the deadly fog in my brain begin to recede. Toby was already moving. For a boy who had spent half his life pretending to be entirely disconnected from the world, he was incredibly fast. He darted into the kitchen, ripping open the heavy oak cabinets. So he bypassed the knife block. Richard would easily overpower us in a close knife fight. Instead, Toby pulled out a massive industrial-grade fire extinguisher from under the sink. I ran to the mudroom, frantically tearing through Richard's perfectly organized winter gear. My hands tossed aside expensive ski jackets and insulated gloves until my fingers wrapped around a long, rigid pole. It was a heavy-duty cattle prod, a high-voltage shock stick Richard kept for the livestock down in the lower valley. I pressed the test button. A terrifying, bright blue arc of electricity crackled to life, the sharp buzz echoing in the small room. We hurried back to the living room, the freezing wind now whipping the curtains into a frenzy. The beautiful log cabin was now a freezing, shattered war zone. "Where do we go?" Toby asked, his teeth chattering from the bitter cold. "Do we hide upstairs?" I looked at the heavy front door, gripping the cattle prod so tightly my knuckles turned white. "No," I whispered. "We don't run upstairs. We hide right here in the shadows. He thinks we are weak. He thinks we are already dying. When he walks through that door, we show him exactly what happens when you corner a desperate animal. Boom, boom, boom." A massive pounding on the heavy front door made me jump out of my skin. My heart leaped into my throat as I crept to the window and peeked through a tiny crack in the freezing curtains. Through the swirling snow, I saw a heavy brown winter coat and a shining silver star on the chest. It was the local sheriff. "Oh my God, we are saved!" I gasped, relief washing over me like a warm wave. I immediately turned to unbolt the door, but before my hand even touched the lock, a pair of small, desperate arms wrapped around my leg like a vice. Toby was shaking his head violently, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. "Don't open it, Sarah. Please, he isn't here to save us. What are you talking about?" "It's the police, Toby," I whispered frantically, trying to pull away. "They can get us out of here." Toby dragged me down to the freezing floor, his voice trembling but fiercely certain. "I didn't just learn how to hack computers in the dark, Sarah. When you spend 5 years pretending to be deaf, you learn how to really watch people. You learn how to read their lips." He swallowed hard, pointing a shaking finger toward the door. "I saw them. Last week in the driveway." Dad handed him a thick manila envelope, and he told the sheriff there was going to be an unfortunate accident at the cabin during the storm, and he needed someone to make sure the paperwork was handled quietly, with no extra questions asked. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. In psychology, there is a specific kind of trauma known as the collapse of authority trust. From the time we are children, we are deeply conditioned to believe that a uniform means safety. We are taught that the people with the badges are the good guys who will fight off the monsters in the dark. But what happens when the monster is rich enough to buy the badge? What happens when the very law meant to protect you is standing on your porch, waiting to clean up your murder? That realization is infinitely more terrifying than the freezing blizzard outside. The man pounding on our door wasn't a rescuer. He was Richard's accomplice, the cleaner. He had braved a deadly winter storm not to pull us out of the carbon monoxide, but to make sure we were taking our last breaths inside. "Sheriff's Department, open up!" The muffled shout from outside sent a fresh spike of adrenaline straight into my veins. We weren't just fighting the cold and the gas anymore. We were entirely on our own. Click. The heavy clunk of the main breaker being thrown echoed from the utility shed outside. Instantly, the cabin plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. The low hum of the refrigerator died. The glowing digital clocks vanished. The only sound left was the violent, shrieking wind battering the thick log walls. Then, the heavy deadbolt turned. The front door groaned open, letting in a swirling vortex of freezing snow and ice. I clamped a trembling hand tightly over my mouth, pulling Toby against my chest as we crouched in the narrow space behind the granite kitchen island. Heavy boots crunched on the hardwood floor, step by agonizing step. The blizzard outside was 20 degrees below zero, a cold so fierce it could snap tree branches and freeze breath instantly. But the chill radiating from the men walking into the cabin was infinitely worse. Outside was just weather. Inside was the burning, suffocating heat of pure betrayal. It was a sickening contrast. The freezing air stung my exposed skin, yet my blood was boiling with a terrifying, trapped heat. My heart hammered so violently against my ribs I thought it might crack them. "Sarah," Richard called out into the pitch-black room, and his voice wasn't the warm, velvety tone that used to comfort me. It was flat, amused, and dripping with pure venom. "Where are you hiding, you stupid, naive little girl?" I heard the sharp click of a heavy tactical flashlight. The bright beam swept violently across the living room, illuminating the shattered glass of the window we had just broken. "Jesus, Richard," the sheriff muttered, his voice rough and annoyed. "The place is freezing. Did the carbon monoxide get them or not?" "Clearly not, Sheriff." Richard sighed, the beam of his light bouncing off the vaulted wooden ceiling. The stupid hired help actually figured out how to break a window, or maybe it was my defective, useless son. Either way, they couldn't have run out into this storm without freezing to death in 10 minutes. They are still here, cowering in the dark like rats. The heavy leather boots stepped closer to the kitchen. The old floorboards creaked under his weight. Each step felt like a physical blade pressing directly against my throat. I held my breath until my lungs burned. "Come out, Sarah," Richard yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "I paid you to watch my son, not play hide and seek. Did you really think you were special? Did you honestly believe a man like me could ever care about a pathetic, desperate orphan like you? You were nothing but a convenient scapegoat, the perfect, tragic little victim for the evening news." I squeezed my eyes shut. Tears of humiliated rage burned my freezing cheeks. I felt Toby grip my arm, his small fingers digging painfully into my sweater. He was trembling violently, not from the freezing wind blowing through the broken window, but from the crushing weight of his own father's hatred. I looked down at the heavy cattle prod in my shaking hand. The terrified, lonely girl who had walked into this cabin was dead. I wasn't going to let this monster hurt this little boy ever again. The heavy beam of the flashlight swept past the granite counter, stopping dead on the edge of Toby's sneaker. "Well, well," the sheriff muttered, the metallic click of his gun echoing in the dark. "I found the rats." He raised the barrel, aiming straight down at the 12-year-old boy cowering beside me. People often wonder how a submissive, terrified woman, a naive nanny who always followed the rules, could suddenly stand up to two armed men. It isn't movie magic. It is the most primal survival mechanism in the human brain. Usually, when we face severe trauma, we freeze, or we fawn and comply just to stay alive. I had lived in that frozen, compliant state for months, but when a mother, even one without a single drop of shared blood, realizes her child is about to be slaughtered, the brain flips a switch. A massive flood of oxytocin, the chemical of love and bonding, collides with a pure rush of adrenaline. It completely erases hesitation. It triggers maternal aggression. In that split second, you aren't fighting out of hatred or revenge. You are fighting to protect a life. The absolute limit of a gentle person is not submission. When you cross that final boundary, their resistance becomes colder and more ruthless than any predator. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. As the sheriff's finger tightened on the trigger, I launched myself forward. I lunged out from the shadows, or gripping the heavy cattle prod with both hands and rammed the twin metal prongs violently into the side of his neck. I held the button down. A blinding blue arc of electricity exploded in the dark. The sheriff convulsed violently, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling with a deafening crack before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed to the floor like a sack of dead weight. "You crazy bitch!" Richard roared. Before I could swing the prod again, Richard charged at me like a rabid animal. His massive hands clamped down around my throat with terrifying force, lifting me inches off the floor and slamming me backward against the heavy wooden cabinets. I choked, my vision instantly blurring with black spots as his thumbs dug into my windpipe. "Die," he screamed, his face contorted into a hideous, unrecognizable mask of pure rage. Oh, but as I stared into the eyes of the man who had manipulated me, isolated me, and tried to suffocate us in our sleep, I didn't feel the old familiar terror anymore. The scared, lonely girl was entirely gone. As I clawed desperately at his iron grip, fighting for the last bit of oxygen in my burning lungs, I was no longer his victim. I was a cornered wolf protecting her cub. My lungs were screaming for oxygen. The crushing pressure of Richard's massive hands around my throat felt like an iron vice. Slowly and deliberately snapping my windpipe, black spots danced furiously at the edges of my vision. The freezing wind howling through the shattered window was entirely drowned out by the roaring blood rushing in my own ears. I stared helplessly up into his face. The charming, sophisticated gentleman who had gently poured my coffee and promised me a safe family was completely gone. All that remained was a hollow, rabid monster. His teeth were bared. His eyes were completely dead, entirely empty of anything human, driven only by a psychopathic need to erase me. I clawed frantically at his thick wrists, tearing at his skin with my fingernails. But my strength was rapidly fading. My legs kicked weakly against the heavy wooden cabinets. I am going to die here. The thought was a cold, terrifying wave washing over my fading consciousness. I just prayed with my last ounce of spirit that Toby had used the chaotic distraction to run, to hide somewhere deep in the freezing walls where this monster could never, ever find him. But Toby didn't run. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't the roaring wind outside. It was the frantic, desperate tearing of thick hemp rope. Through my blurring, dying vision, I caught a fleeting glimpse of movement high above us. The loft, the narrow wooden balcony that overlooked the main living room. Toby was up there. He must have slipped away in the pitch-black chaos when I shocked the sheriff. The small, terrified boy was leaning dangerously over the wooden railing, his hands desperately sawing a jagged piece of shattered window glass across the thick, braided rope anchored to the main ceiling beam. That thick rope held Richard's most prized possession, a massive, horrifyingly heavy, stuffed moose antler mount. It hung directly over the center of the living room, a brutal, heavy trophy of a creature Richard had hunted and killed years ago. He used to brag about it constantly. It was a disgusting symbol of his absolute dominance over this mountain, and his twisted belief that he could conquer and control any living thing he wanted. Snap! The thick rope finally gave way. Time seemed to slow down to a terrifying, agonizing crawl. Hundreds of pounds of solid bone, heavy wood, and iron mounts plummeted straight down from the vaulted ceiling. It didn't hit the floor. It crashed directly into the center of Richard's broad back. A sickening crunch of bone echoed violently through the cabin, followed instantly by a guttural, agonizing scream. The iron grip around my throat vanished in a split second. Richard's massive body was violently thrown forward, crashing face first into the hardwood floor beneath the crushing, inescapable weight of the massive antlers. I collapsed to the floor like a broken doll. I gasped frantically, sucking the freezing, biting air into my burning lungs. I coughed so hard I tasted blood, wrapping my trembling arms around my badly bruised neck as I scrambled desperately backward, dragging myself away from his twitching, groaning body. I sat against the freezing wall, staring at the horrifying scene unfolding in the dark. Richard was pinned flat to the floor, writhing in absolute agony beneath the crushing weight of his own hunting trophy. It was a perfectly poetic, brutal kind of justice. The arrogant timber magnate, the malignant narcissist who truly believed he was the untouchable master of this estate, who believed he could use his massive wealth and power to cage and slaughter innocent people. He had just been struck down by the very symbol of his own violent arrogance. He thought he owned this cabin. He thought he owned us. But tonight, the cabin fought back. I looked up toward the dark loft. A small, trembling face peered over the wooden railing, looking down at me through the freezing shadows. Toby, the boy, who had been voiceless and powerless his entire life, had just slain the dragon. Richard groaned, a wet, rattling sound escaping his chest as he shifted under the crushing weight of the massive antlers. Blood trickled down the side of his face, pooling on the expensive hardwood, but even pinned to the freezing floor, his eyes were locked onto something else entirely. The sheriff's gun. It had slid across the room during the violent struggle, coming to rest just a few inches from Richard's outstretched, trembling fingers. In he was dragging his bloody hand, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, toward the cold black steel. If he reached that weapon, it was over. He wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in me, and then he would drag his broken body up those stairs to finish Toby. My chest heaved. I had dropped the shock stick during the chaos. My hands were completely empty. I patted my heavy winter coat frantically until my frozen, bruised fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. The emergency flare gun. I had shoved it deep into my pocket when we were tearing through the mudroom earlier. I pulled the heavy orange pistol out, my hands shaking so violently I could barely cock the stiff metal hammer. Click. The sharp mechanical sound made Richard freeze instantly. He slowly turned his head, his terrifying, bloodshot eyes locking onto the wide barrel pointed directly at his face. "Shoot him, Sarah!" Toby screamed from the dark loft, his voice cracking with pure, desperate panic. Richard coughed, a sick, twisted smile forming on his bleeding lips. "You don't have the guts, you pathetic little orphan," he rasped, his breath misting in the freezing air. "You're too weak. You are a nobody. You will never pull that trigger." My finger trembled heavily against the cold plastic. He was right about one thing. I was terrified. If I pulled this trigger, the magnesium shell would burn through his skull at 2,000 degrees. He would die exactly the way he lived, violently and mercilessly. It would be so incredibly easy to just erase him right now, to end this waking nightmare right here on this bloody floor and secure our safety forever. Oh, but looking down at this broken, pathetic monster, breathing heavy in the freezing dark, I realized something deep inside my own soul. If I killed him in cold blood, I would be stepping into the exact same darkness that had consumed his life. I wouldn't just be surviving. I would be crossing a moral line I could never, ever walk back from. He wanted me to be a killer. He wanted me to prove that deep down, human beings are just as ruthless and selfish as he is. But I am not a murderer. I'm a protector. I didn't lower the gun. I tightened my grip, holding his hateful, mocking stare for one long, silent second. "I don't need to kill you, Richard," I whispered, my voice finally steady and cold. "I just need the world to see exactly what you are." I whipped my arm sharply to the right. aiming the wide barrel straight toward the shattered living room window, and pulled the heavy trigger. Bang! The brutal recoil nearly knocked me backward off my feet. A blinding, searing streak of brilliant red fire ripped through the freezing cabin. It blasted out into the howling storm, soaring high above the dark, snow-covered pine trees before exploding into a massive, blinding sphere of crimson light. It hung there in the freezing night sky, a brilliant burning beacon tearing apart his perfectly constructed darkness. That red light wasn't just a desperate cry for physical rescue. It was the blazing fire of pure justice. It was a light illuminating every single lie, every cruel manipulation, and every ounce of psychological torture he had hidden behind his expensive suits and perfect grieving father's smile. For a moment, when there was only the sound of the howling wind rushing through the broken glass, Richard laughed, a wet, mocking sound from the floor. "No one is out there," he wheezed, his bloody fingers still inching toward the dropped pistol. "You just wasted your only shot." But then, a new sound pierced the raging storm. Not the wind. A deep, heavy mechanical roar. A horn. A massive, deafening air horn echoing through the snow-choked valley. Through the shattered window, I saw them, cutting through the blinding whiteout on the main mountain pass just half a mile away, the flashing amber and blue strobe lights of a massive state snowplow convoy. They had been trapped clearing the interstate, and they had seen the blinding red flare, the heavy, high, or rumbling sound of massive diesel engines grew louder and louder as the giant plows turned their heavy grills toward our private access road. Richard's twisted smile completely vanished. The horrifying reality finally washed over his blood-stained face. His perfect, quiet, untraceable crime was entirely ruined. He wasn't going to be the tragic, grieving father on the evening news tomorrow. He was going to be dragged out of this cabin in handcuffs, exposed to the entire world for the abusive monster he truly was. I stood up, my legs trembling but firmly planted on the ground, and watched the approaching amber lights paint the freezing walls of our golden cage. The long, terrifying night was finally over. "State police! Drop the weapon!" The deafening shout was followed instantly by the heavy, dissatisfying sound of multiple boots swarming the ruined cabin. The corrupt local sheriff didn't even try to reach for his gun. He slowly raised his trembling hands, dropping to his knees as two heavily armed state troopers slammed him face first onto the wooden floor. Paramedics rushed in behind them, their heavy medical bags thudding against the floorboards. I didn't watch as they dragged Richard's broken, groaning body onto a stretcher. The sight of him no longer held any terror for me, only a deep, profound pity for a man who had built his entire life on horrific lies. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on the icy metal bumper of an idling ambulance. The flashing amber and blue lights painted the blowing snow in rhythmic, chaotic bursts. A paramedic had draped a crinkly silver thermal blanket tightly around my shivering shoulders. I looked down. Toby was sitting right beside me. He was staring blankly at the massive, glowing floodlights of the plow trucks surrounding the cabin. He still held his thick, noise-canceling headphones tightly in his lap. The terrifying adrenaline was finally starting to fade, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. I reached out, gently placing my trembling hand over his. "Toby," I whispered, my voice rough. "It is over. You don't have to wear those anymore." He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead into the driving snow. For a terrifying second, I thought the sheer horror of the night had actually pushed him back into the deep, dark silence he had used to survive. I thought I had lost him to the trauma. "Toby." I breathed, my heart aching. Slowly, his small hand turned over, his freezing fingers gripping mine. He squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt. He squeezed his eyes shut. And then, the dam finally broke. A ragged, agonizing sob tore out of his throat. He threw his arms around my neck, burying his small face deep into my chest. He wasn't crying quietly like a frightened, calculating survivor anymore. He was wailing. He was screaming out 5 entire years of silent terror, 5 years of horrific abuse, 5 years of being a ghost in his own house. I wrapped both arms tightly around his shaking body, pulling him as close as I possibly could, burying my face in his snow-damp hair. I let him cry. I let him scream every ounce of that poison out of his system into the freezing mountain air. I cried with him. My tears were completely different from the ones I had cried hours ago. They weren't tears of fear or betrayal or the desperate, lonely ache of an orphan. They were the tears of a mother who had just pulled her child out of the fire. We were sitting in the back of an ambulance, freezing in a catastrophic blizzard, entirely surrounded by the wreckage of a horrifying crime scene. But as I held this incredible, brave little boy tightly against my chest, I finally knew exactly what a real home felt like. 6 months later, the heavy wooden doors of the state courthouse closed with a quiet, final thud. The judge's gavel had just come down. Richard was sentenced to life in a maximum security federal prison, without the slightest possibility of parole. As the bailiffs clamped the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists, he turned his head to look at me one last time. He looked so incredibly pathetic. The expensive, perfectly tailored suits were gone, completely replaced by a cheap, wrinkled orange jumpsuit. The charming, arrogant posture that had once commanded boardrooms was entirely broken, but deep in his eyes, I could still see that sick, desperate need for control. He stood there staring at me, waiting for my reaction. He wanted me to scream at him. He wanted me to cry, to curse his name, to show him that the horrific trauma he inflicted had permanently scarred my soul. He needed to know that he still mattered. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I didn't smile and I didn't glare. I just sat there, holding Toby's hand, and looked right through him as if he were completely invisible. Then people often misunderstand what forgiveness and moving on actually mean. Society constantly tells us that if we don't hold tightly onto our burning rage, we are somehow being weak, that letting go means we are letting the abuser win. But true psychological freedom is the exact opposite. Choosing peace is the most terrifying, devastating weapon you can ever use against a malignant narcissist. They absolutely feed on your emotional reactions. They desperately want to be the eternal villain in your mind, because as long as you hate them, they still have power over your thoughts. To look at the monster who tried to suffocate you in the dark and feel absolutely nothing. To deny them even a single ounce of your precious energy. That is the ultimate victory. My absolute silence, my complete indifference, was the loudest, some most agonizing punishment he could ever receive. He was going to spend the rest of his miserable life locked in a concrete box, knowing that he hadn't broken me. When Toby and I walked out of those heavy courthouse doors and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun, everything felt different. The freezing nightmare of the log cabin felt like a lifetime ago. I wasn't the terrified, lonely orphan who had desperately taken a nanny job just to feel a sense of belonging. I held a thick manila envelope tightly against my chest. Inside was a piece of paper signed by a family court judge, granting me full, permanent legal custody of Toby. He was officially, legally, my son. We are always conditioned from birth to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that family is strictly defined by shared DNA, or by matching birth certificates and by biological family trees. But when the freezing blizzard is howling outside and the toxic carbon monoxide is quietly filling your lungs, DNA means absolutely nothing. Family isn't about who brought you into this world. Family is about who stands by your side when your entire world is ending. It is about who reaches their hand out to pull you from the dark, even when their own hands are shaking with terror. Toby looked up at me. the bright sunlight reflecting beautifully in his clear, innocent eyes. For the first time in his entire life, the heavy, crushing weight was completely gone from his small shoulders. He smiled, a real, genuine, carefree smile. We walked down the long, concrete courthouse steps together, leaving the darkness, the snow, and Richard permanently behind us. And we didn't share a single drop of blood. But as we walked to our car to go home, I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally found the family I had been searching for my entire life. It is so incredibly easy to be blinded by a perfect smile and a beautiful home. But remember, the most dangerous prisons are often disguised as golden cages. If you or someone you know is secretly trapped by psychological abuse, please share this story. Let them know that fighting back is possible, and they are infinitely stronger than their captor thinks. I want to hear from you. What went through your mind in that exact moment when Toby finally pulled off his headphones and spoke? Tell me in the comments down below. If Sarah and Toby's journey touched your heart, please subscribe, stay safe, and never let anyone silence your voice.